Welcome, dear listener. You've entered Audible Archives, a sanctuary of sound where lost tales awaken. Your guide through these ancient echoes and timeless legends. So lean back, breathe deep, and let the story begin. This is Audible Archives, where every word holds a whisper of magic. You're listening to Audible Archives. I'm Raul, your host and guide through true stories that still echo through history. This is the beginning of one man's nightmare and his relentless fight for freedom. In 1841, Solomon Northup was a free black man, a husband, a father, a violinist. Then he was deceived and sold into slavery. These first 5 chapters mark the calm before the storm, his life in Saratoga, the cruel betrayal, and the iron chains that would change everything. This is part 1 of 12 Years a Slave, chapters 1 to 5. The journey into darkness begins here.
Chapter 1. Having been born a freeman, and for more than 30 years enjoyed the blessings of liberty in a free state, and having the end of that time been kidnapped and sold into slavery, where I remained until happily rescued in the month of January, 1853. After a bondage of 12 years, it has been suggested that an account of my life and fortunes would not be uninteresting to the public. Since my return to liberty, I have not failed to perceive the increasing interest throughout the northern states in regard to the subject of slavery. Works of fiction, professing to portray its features in their more pleasing as well as more repugnant aspects, have been circulated to an extent unprecedented, and, as I understand, have created a fruitful topic of comment and discussion. I can speak of slavery only so far as it came under my own observation, only so far as I have known and experienced it in my own person. My object is to give a candid and truthful statement of facts, to repeat the story of my life without exaggeration, leaving it for others to determine whether even the pages of fiction present a picture of more cruel wrong or a severer bondage. As far back as I have been able to ascertain, my ancestors on the paternal side were slaves in Rhode Island. They belonged to a family by the name of Northup, one of whom, removing to the state of New York, settled at Hoosick in Rensselaer County. He brought with him Mintus Northup, my father. On the death of this gentleman, which must have occurred some 50 years ago, my father became free, having been emancipated by a direction in his will. Henry B. Northup, Esq. Of Sandy Hill, a distinguished counselor at law, and the man to whom, under Providence, I am indebted for my present liberty, and my return to the society of my wife and children, is a relative of the family in which my forefathers were thus held to service, and from which they took the name I bear. To this fact may be attributed the persevering interest he has taken in my behalf. Sometime after my father's liberation, he removed to the town of Minerva, Essex County, NY, where I was born in the month of July, 1808. How long he remained in the latter place, I have not the means of definitely ascertaining. From thence he removed to Granville, Washington County, near a place known as Slyboro, where for some years he labored on the farm of Clark Northup, also a relative of his old master. From thence he removed to the Alden farm at Moss Street, a short distance north of the village of Sandy Hill, and from thence to the farm now owned by Russell Pratt, situated on the road leading from Fort Edward to Argyle, where he continued to reside until his death, which took place on the 22d day of November, 1829. He left a widow and 2 children, myself and Joseph, an elder brother. The latter is still living in the county of Oswego, near the city of that name. My mother died during the period of my captivity. Though born a slave and laboring under the disadvantages to which my unfortunate race is subjected, my father was a man respected for his industry and integrity, as many now living, who well remember him, are ready to testify. His whole life was passed in the peaceful pursuits of agriculture, never seeking employment in those more menial positions, which seem to be especially allotted to the children of Africa. Besides giving us an education surpassing that ordinarily bestowed upon children in our condition, he acquired, by his diligence and economy, a sufficient property qualification to entitle him to the right of suffrage. He was accustomed to speak to us of his early life, and although at all times cherishing the warmest emotions of kindness and even of affection toward the family, in whose house he had been a bondsman, he nevertheless comprehended the system of slavery and dwelt with sorrow on the degradation of his race. He endeavored to imbue our minds with sentiments of morality and to teach us to place our trust and confidence in him who regards the humblest as well as the highest of his creatures. How often since that time has the recollection of his paternal counsels occurred to me, while lying in a slave hut in the distant and sickly regions of Louisiana, smarting with the undeserved wounds which an inhuman master had inflicted, and longing only for the grave which had covered him, to shield me also from the lash of the oppressor. In the churchyard at Sandy Hill, an humble stone marks the spot where he reposes, after having worthily performed the duties appertaining to the lowly sphere wherein God had appointed him to walk. Up to this period, I had been principally engaged with my father in the labors of the farm. The leisure hours allowed me were generally either employed over my books or playing on the violin, an amusement which was the ruling passion of my youth. It has also been the source of consolation since, affording pleasure to the simple beings with whom my lot was cast, and beguiling my own thoughts for many hours from the painful contemplation of my fate. On Christmas Day, 1829, I was married to, in Hampton, a colored girl then living in the vicinity of our residence. The ceremony was performed at Fort Edward by Timothy Eddy Esq, a magistrate of that town and still a prominent citizen of the place. She had resided a long time at Sandy Hill with Mr. Baird, proprietor of the Eagle Tavern, and also in the family of Reverend Alexander Proudfoot of Salem. This gentleman for many years had presided over the Presbyterian Society at the latter place, and was widely distinguished for his learning and piety, and still holds in grateful remembrance the exceeding kindness and the excellent counsels of that good man. She is not able to determine the exact line of her descent, but the blood of 3 races mingles in her veins. It is difficult to tell whether the red, white, or black predominates. The union of them all, however, in her origin, has given her a singular but pleasing expression, such as is rarely to be seen. Though somewhat resembling, yet she cannot properly be styled a quadroon, a class to which I have omitted to mention my mother belonged. I had just now passed the period of my minority, having reached the age of 21 years in the month of July previous. Deprived of the advice and assistance of my father, with a wife dependent upon me for support, I resolved to enter upon a life of industry, and notwithstanding the obstacle of color, and the consciousness of my lowly state, indulged in pleasant dreams of a good time coming, when the possession of some humble habitation, with a few surrounding acres, should reward my labors, and bring me the means of happiness and comfort. From the time of my marriage to this day, the love I have borne my wife has been sincere and unabated, and only those who have felt the glowing tenderness a father cherishes for his offspring can appreciate my affection for the beloved children which have since been born to us. This much I deem appropriate and necessary to say, in order that those who read these pages may comprehend the poignancy of those sufferings I have been doomed to bear. Immediately upon our marriage, we commenced housekeeping in the old yellow building then standing at the southern extremity of Fort Edward Village, and which has since been transformed into a modern mansion and lately occupied by Captain Lathrop. It is known as the Fort House. In this building, the courts were sometime held after the organization of the county. It was also occupied by Burgoyne in 1777, being situated near the old fort on the left bank of the Hudson. During the winter, I was employed with others repairing the Champlain Canal, on that section over which William Van Nortwick was superintendent. David McKeitron had the immediate charge of the men in whose company I labored. By the time the canal opened in the spring, I was enabled, from the savings of my wages, to purchase a pair of horses and other things necessarily required in the business of navigation. Having hired several efficient hands to assist me, I entered into contracts for the transportation of large rafts of timber from Lake Champlain to Troy. Dyer Beckwith and a Mr. Bartamy of Whitehall accompanied me on several trips. During the season, I became perfectly familiar with the art and mysteries of rafting and knowledge, which afterwards enabled me to render profitable service to a worthy master and to astonish the simple-witted lumbermen on the banks of the Bayou Boeuf. In one of my voyages down Lake Champlain, I was induced to make a visit to Canada. Repairing to Montreal, I visited the cathedral and other places of interest in that city, from whence I continued my excursion to Kingston and other towns, obtaining a knowledge of localities, which was also of service to me afterwards, as will appear towards the close of this narrative. Having completed my contracts on the canal satisfactorily to myself and to my employer, and not wishing to remain idle, now that the navigation of the canal was again suspended, I entered into another contract with Med Gun to cut a large quantity of wood. In this business, I was engaged during the winter of 1831 to 32. With the return of spring, and myself conceived the project of taking a farm in the neighborhood. I had been accustomed from earliest youth to agricultural labors, and it was an occupation congenial to my tastes. I accordingly entered into arrangements for a part of the old Alden farm, on which my father formerly resided. With 1 cow, 1 swine, a yoke of fine oxen, I had lately purchased of Lewis Brown in Hartford and other personal property and effects. We proceeded to our new home in Kingsbury. That year I planted 25 acres of corn, sowed large fields of oats, and commenced farming upon as large a scale as my utmost means would permit, and was diligent about the house affairs, while I toiled laboriously in the field. On this place we continued to reside until 1834. In the winter season I had numerous calls to play on the violin. Wherever the young people assembled to dance, I was almost invariably there. Throughout the surrounding villages, my fiddle was notorious, and also, during her long residence at the Eagle Tavern, had become somewhat famous as a cook. During court weeks and on public occasions, she was employed at high wages in the kitchen at Cheryl's Coffee House. We always returned home from the performance of these services with money in our pockets, so that, with fiddling, cooking, and farming, we soon found ourselves in the possession of abundance, and in fact, leading a happy and prosperous life. Well, indeed, would it have been for us had we remained on the farm at Kingsbury. But the time came when the next step was to be taken towards the cruel destiny that awaited me. In March 1834, we removed to Saratoga Springs. We occupied a house belonging to Daniel O'Brien on the north side of Washington Street. At that time, Isaac Taylor kept a large boarding house, known as Washington Hall at the north end of Broadway. He employed me to drive a hack, in which capacity I worked for him 2 years. After this time, I was generally employed through the visiting season, as also was, and in the United States Hotel and other public houses of the place. In winter seasons, I relied upon my violin, though during the construction of the Troy and Saratoga Railroad, I performed many hard days' labor upon it. I was in the habit at Saratoga of purchasing articles necessary for my family at the stores of Mr. C. Fast Parker and Mr. William Perry, gentlemen towards whom, for many acts of kindness, I entertained feelings of strong regard. It was for this reason that 12 years afterwards I caused to be directed to them the letter, which is hereinafter inserted, and which was the means in the hands of Mr. Northup of my fortunate deliverance. While living at the United States Hotel, I frequently met with slaves who had accompanied their masters from the South. They were always well dressed and well provided for, leading apparently an easy life, with but few of its ordinary troubles to perplex them. Many times they entered into conversation with me on the subject of slavery. Almost uniformly, I found they cherished a secret desire for liberty. Some of them expressed the most ardent anxiety to escape, and consulted me on the best method of effecting it. The fear of punishment, however, which they knew was certain to attend their recapture and return, in all cases proved sufficient to deter them from the experiment. Having all my life breathed the free air of the North, and conscious that I possessed the same feelings and affections that find a place in the white man's breast, conscious, moreover, of an intelligence equal to that of some men, at least with a fairer skin, I was too ignorant, perhaps too independent, to conceive how anyone could be content to live in the abject condition of a slave. I could not comprehend the justice of that law or that religion which upholds or recognizes the principle of slavery, and never once, I am proud to say, did I fail to counsel anyone who came to me to watch his opportunity and strike for freedom. I continued to reside at Saratoga until the spring of 1841. The flattering anticipations which, 7 years before, had seduced us from the quiet farmhouse on the east side of the Hudson had not been realized. Though always in comfortable circumstances, we had not prospered. The society and associations at that world-renowned watering place were not calculated to preserve the simple habits of industry and economy to which I had been accustomed, but, on the contrary, to substitute others in their stead, tending to shiftlessness and extravagance. At this time, we were the parents of 3 children: Elizabeth, Margaret, and Alonzo. Elizabeth, the eldest, was in her 10th year. Margaret was 2 years younger, and little Alonzo had just passed his 5th birthday. They filled our house with gladness. Their young voices were music in our ears. Many an airy castle did their mother and myself build for the little innocents. When not at labor, I was always walking with them, clad in their best attire, through the streets and groves of Saratoga. Their presence was my delight, and I clasped them to my bosom with as warm and tender love as if their clouded skins had been as white as snow. Thus far the history of my life presents nothing whatever unusual, nothing but the common hopes and loves and labors of an obscure colored man, making his humble progress in the world. But now I had reached a turning point in my existence, reached the threshold of unutterable wrong and sorrow and despair. Now had I approached within the shadow of the cloud, into the thick darkness whereof I was soon to disappear, thenceforward to be hidden from the eyes of all my kindred, and shut out from the sweet light of liberty for many a weary year. Before the darkness fell, before the chains clinked around his wrists, Solomon Northup lived as few black men of his time were allowed to live, free-skilled, self-made. Chapter 1 is not simply a beginning. It is a memorial to everything he had: to walk in Saratoga's sun as a free man, to raise a family with dignity, to play music by firelight and earn coin with art. These were not just pleasures. They were proof of personhood, and they would soon be ripped away. This chapter is quiet, but its silence is deceiving. Behind Solomon's calm recollection, there is tension, like a rope slowly tightening. We see a man at peace, but we know he is standing on the edge of an abyss. And what makes that fall so cruel is how precious the life is before it is taken. Solomon Northup was not an imagined character. He lived. He walked these streets. He played that violin. And when this memoir was published in 1853, it shocked the nation because it showed that no free black man was truly safe, not even in the North. He was not poor. He was not uneducated. He was not born into chains. And that is the very point. His story exposed slavery not as a Southern disease, but as an American sickness. Notice the emphasis on the ordinary: work, marriage, children, music. These aren't romanticized memories. They're real, intimate, and that reality makes their loss more devastating. The violin will return later in the story, sometimes as comfort, sometimes as curse. But here, in chapter 1, it still sings of freedom. And so the stage is set. The man is known, his life revealed, and now the trap waits in the shadows. Because the greatest cruelty in Solomon Northup's journey is not that he was enslaved. It's that he remembered what it was to be free. Chapter 2. One morning, towards the latter part of the month of March, 1841, having at that time no particular business to engage my attention, I was walking about the village of Saratoga Springs, thinking to myself where I might obtain some present employment until the busy season should arrive, and as was her usual custom, had gone over to Sandy Hill, a distance of some 20 miles, to take charge of the culinary department at Cheryl's Coffee House during a session of the court. Elizabeth, I think, had accompanied her. Margaret and Alonzo were with their aunt at Saratoga, on the corner of Congress Street and Broadway, near the tavern. Then, and for aught I know to the contrary, still kept by Mr. Moon, I was met by two gentlemen of respectable appearance, both of whom were entirely unknown to me. I have the impression that they were introduced to me by someone of my acquaintances. But who? I have in vain endeavored to recall, with the remark that I was an expert player on the violin. At any rate, they immediately entered into conversation on that subject, making numerous inquiries touching my proficiency in that respect. My responses being to all appearances satisfactory, they proposed to engage my services for a short period, stating, at the same time, I was just such a person as their business required. Their names, as they afterwards gave them to me, were Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton, though whether these were their true appellations, I have strong reasons to doubt. The former was a man apparently 40 years of age, somewhat short and thick-set, with a countenance indicating shrewdness and intelligence. He wore a black frock coat and black hat, and said he resided either at Rochester or at Syracuse. The latter was a young man of fair complexion and light eyes, and I should judge, had not passed the age of 25. He was tall and slender, dressed in a snuff-colored coat with glossy hat and vest of elegant pattern. His whole apparel was in the extreme of fashion. His appearance was somewhat effeminate, but prepossessing, and there was about him an easy air that showed he had mingled with the world. They were connected, as they informed me, with a circus company, then in the city of Washington, that they were on their way thither to rejoin it, having left it for a short time to make an excursion northward, for the purpose of seeing the country and repaying their expenses by an occasional exhibition. They also remarked that they found much difficulty in procuring music for their entertainments, and that if I would accompany them as far as New York, they would give me $1 for each day's services, and $3 in addition for every night I played at their performances, besides sufficient to pay the expenses of my return from New York to Saratoga. I at once accepted the tempting offer, both for the reward it promised, and from a desire to visit the metropolis. They were anxious to leave immediately. Thinking my absence would be brief, I did not deem it necessary to write to and whither I had gone. In fact, supposing that my return, perhaps, would be as soon as hers. So taking a change of linen and my violin, I was ready to depart. The carriage was brought round a covered one, drawn by a pair of noble bays, altogether forming an elegant establishment. Their baggage, consisting of 3 large trunks, was fastened on the rack and mounting to the driver's seat, where they took their places in the rear. I drove away from Saratoga on the road to Albany, elated with my new position, and happy as I had ever been on any day in all my life. We passed through Ballston and, striking the Ridge Road, as it is called, if my memory correctly serves me, followed it direct to Albany. We reached that city before dark and stopped at a hotel southward from Museum. This night I had an opportunity of witnessing one of their performances, the only one, during the whole period I was with them. Hamilton was stationed at the door. I formed the orchestra, while Brown provided the entertainment. It consisted in throwing balls, dancing on a rope, frying pancakes in a hat, causing invisible pigs to squeal, and other like feats of ventriloquism and legerdemain. The audience was extraordinarily sparse, and not of the selectest character at that, and Hamilton's report of the proceeds presented but a beggarly account of empty boxes. Early next morning we renewed our journey. The burden of their conversation now was the expression of an anxiety to reach the circus without delay. They hurried forward, without again stopping to exhibit, and in due course of time we reached New York, taking lodgings at a house on the west side of the city. in a street running from Broadway to the river. I suppose my journey was at an end, and expected in a day or two at least to return to my friends and family at Saratoga. Brown and Hamilton, however, began to importune me to continue with them to Washington. They alleged that immediately on their arrival, now that the summer season was approaching, the circus would set out for the north. They promised me a situation and high wages if I would accompany them. Largely did they expatiate on the advantages that would result to me, and such were the flattering representations they made, that I finally concluded to accept the offer. The next morning they suggested that inasmuch as we were about entering a slave state, it would be well, before leaving New York, to procure free papers. The idea struck me as a prudent one, though I think it would scarcely have occurred to me, had they not proposed it. We proceeded at once to what I understood to be the custom house. They made oath to certain facts, showing I was a free man. A paper was drawn up and handed us, with the direction to take it to the clerk's office. We did so, and the clerk having added something to it, for which he was paid 6 shillings, we returned again to the custom house. Some further formalities were gone through with before it was completed. When, paying the officer $2, I placed the papers in my pocket and started with my 2 friends to our hotel. I thought at the time, I must confess, that the papers were scarcely worth the cost of obtaining them, the apprehension of danger to my personal safety never having suggested itself to me in the remotest manner. The clerk to whom we were directed, I remember, made a memorandum in a large book, which I presume is in the office yet, a reference to the entries during the latter part of March or 1st of April 1841. I have no doubt will satisfy the incredulous, at least so far as this particular transaction is concerned. With the evidence of freedom in my possession, the next day after our arrival in New York, we crossed the ferry to Jersey City and took the road to Philadelphia. Here we remained one night, continuing our journey towards Baltimore early in the morning. In due time, we arrived in the latter city and stopped at a hotel near the railroad depot, either kept by Mr. Rathbone or known as the Rathbone House. All the way from New York, their anxiety to reach the circus seemed to grow more and more intense. We left the carriage at Baltimore and, entering the cars, proceeded to Washington, at which place we arrived just at nightfall, the evening previous to the funeral of General Harrison, and stopped at Gadsby's Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue. After supper, they called me to their apartments and paid me $43, a sum greater than my wages amounted to, which act of generosity was in consequence, they said, of their not having exhibited as often as they had given me to anticipate during our trip from Saratoga. They, moreover, informed me that it had been the intention of the circus company to leave Washington the next morning, but that on account of the funeral, they had concluded to remain another day. They were then, as they had been from the time of our first meeting, extremely kind. No opportunity was omitted of addressing me in the language of approbation, while, on the other hand, I was certainly much prepossessed in their favor. I gave them my confidence without reserve, and would freely have trusted them to almost any extent. Their constant conversation and manner towards me, their foresight in suggesting the idea of free papers, and 100 other little acts, unnecessary to be repeated, all indicated that they were friends indeed, sincerely solicitous for my welfare. I know not, but they were innocent of the great wickedness of which I now believe them guilty. Whether they were accessory to my misfortunes, subtle and inhuman monsters in the shape of men designedly luring me away from home and family and liberty, for the sake of gold, those who read these pages will have the same means of determining as myself. If they were innocent, my sudden disappearance must have been unaccountable indeed. But revolving in my mind all the attending circumstances, I never yet could indulge toward them so charitable a supposition. After receiving the money from them, of which they appeared to have an abundance, they advised me not to go into the streets that night, inasmuch as I was unacquainted with the customs of the city. Promising to remember their advice, I left them together, and soon after was shown by a colored servant to a sleeping room in the back part of the hotel on the ground floor. I laid down to rest, thinking of home and wife and children and the long distance that stretched between us, until I fell asleep. But no good angel of pity came to my bedside. Bidding me to fly, no voice of mercy forewarned me in my dreams of the trials that were just at hand. The next day, there was a great pageant in Washington. The roar of cannon and the tolling of bells filled the air, while many houses were shrouded with crape, and the streets were black with people. As the day advanced, the procession made its appearance, coming slowly through the avenue, carriage after carriage in long succession, while thousands upon thousands followed on foot, all moving to the sound of melancholy music. They were bearing the dead body of Harrison to the grave. From early in the morning, I was constantly in the company of Hamilton and Brown. They were the only persons I knew in Washington. We stood together as the funeral pomp passed by. I remember distinctly how the window glass would break and rattle to the ground after each report of the cannon they were firing in the burial ground. We went to the Capitol and walked a long time about the grounds. In the afternoon, they strolled toward the president's house, all the time keeping me near to them and pointing out various places of interest. As yet, I had seen nothing of the circus. In fact, I had thought of it but little, if at all, amidst the excitement of the day. My friends, several times during the afternoon, entered drinking saloons and called for liquor. They were by no means in the habit, however, so far as I knew them, of indulging to excess. On these occasions, after serving themselves, they would pour out a glass and hand it to me. I did not become intoxicated, as may be inferred from what subsequently occurred. Towards evening, and soon after partaking of one of these potations, I began to experience most unpleasant sensations. I felt extremely ill. My head commenced aching a dull, heavy pain, inexpressibly disagreeable. At the supper table, I was without appetite. The sight and flavor of food was nauseous. About dark, the same servant conducted me to the room I had occupied the previous night. Brown and Hamilton advised me to retire, commiserating me kindly and expressing hopes that I would be better in the morning. Divesting myself of coat and boots merely, I threw myself upon the bed. It was impossible to sleep. The pain in my head continued to increase until it became almost unbearable. In a short time, I became thirsty. My lips were parched. I could think of nothing but water of lakes and flowing rivers, of brooks where I had stooped to drink, and of the dripping bucket, rising with its cool and overflowing nectar from the bottom of the well. Towards midnight, as near as I could judge, I arose, unable longer to bear such intensity of thirst. I was a stranger in the house, and knew nothing of its apartments. There was no one up, as I could observe. Groping about at random, I knew not where, I found the way at last to a kitchen in the basement. 2 or 3 colored servants were moving through it, one of whom, a woman, gave me 2 glasses of water. It afforded momentary relief, but by the time I had reached my room again, the same burning desire of drink, the same tormenting thirst, had again returned. It was even more torturing than before, as was also the wild pain in my head, if such a thing could be. I was in sore distress and most excruciating agony. I seemed to stand on the brink of madness. The memory of that night of horrible suffering will follow me to the grave. In the course of an hour or more after my return from the kitchen, I was conscious of someone entering my room. There seemed to be several, a mingling of various voices, but how many or who they were, I cannot tell. Whether Brown and Hamilton were among them is a mere matter of conjecture. I only remember, with any degree of distinctness, that I was told it was necessary to go to a physician and procure medicine, and that pulling on my boots without coat or hat, I followed them through a long passageway or alley into the open street. It ran out at right angles from Pennsylvania Avenue. On the opposite side, there was a light burning in a window. My impression is there were then 3 persons with me, but it is altogether indefinite and vague, and like the memory of a painful dream. Going towards the light, which I imagined proceeded from a physician's office, and which seemed to recede as I advanced, is the last glimmering recollection I can now recall. From that moment, I was insensible. How long I remained in that condition, whether only that night, or many days and nights, I do not know. But when consciousness returned, I found myself alone in utter darkness and in chains. The pain in my head had subsided in a measure, but I was very faint and weak. I was sitting upon a low bench made of rough boards, and without coat or hat. I was handcuffed. Around my ankles also were a pair of heavy fetters. One end of a chain was fastened to a large ring in the floor, the other to the fetters on my ankles. I tried in vain to stand upon my feet, waking from such a painful trance. It was some time before I could collect my thoughts. Where was I? What was the meaning of these chains? Where were Brown and Hamilton? What had I done to deserve imprisonment in such a dungeon? I could not comprehend. There was a blank of some indefinite period, preceding my awakening in that lonely place, the events of which the utmost stretch of memory was unable to recall. I listened intently for some sign or sound of life, but nothing broke the oppressive silence, save the clinking of my chains. Whenever I chanced to move, I spoke aloud, but the sound of my voice startled me. I felt in my pockets, so far as the fetters would allow, far enough indeed, to ascertain that I had not only been robbed of liberty, but that my money and free papers were also gone. Then did the idea begin to break upon my mind, at first dim and confused, that I had been kidnapped, but that I thought was incredible. There must have been some misapprehension, some unfortunate mistake. It could not be that a free citizen of New York, who had wronged no man nor violated any law, should be dealt with thus inhumanly. The more I contemplated my situation, however, the more I became confirmed in my suspicions. It was a desolate thought indeed. I felt there was no trust or mercy in unfeeling man, and commending myself to the God of the oppressed, bowed my head upon my fettered hands and wept most bitterly. In Chapter 2, we leave the sun-drenched comfort of Saratoga and step into the shifting shadows of deception. What begins as an opportunity will become a cage. 2 men, Brown and Hamilton, arrive with smiles. They shake hands, offer compliments, and speak of profit, music, and fame. But beneath their polished words, you can almost hear the soft rustle of a noose being prepared. The streets of Washington are lively. The Capitol dome gleams in the distance. But Solomon walks among predators in plain clothes. Every word they speak, every gesture is designed to disarm him. He is lulled not by force, but by friendliness. And that is the genius of this betrayal, because no chains are visible yet, only champagne glasses and a promise of payment. And then the sickness. Solomon drinks, the room spins, and suddenly the floor seems farther away. This is not a fever, not a dream. It is the first drop into a bottomless pit. The fact that he was drugged, not abducted, is key. This wasn't brute force. It was betrayal at the level of chemistry. He is being erased, molecule by molecule. Chapter 2 introduces us to a terrifying truth. Slavery wasn't only about auction blocks and overseers. It was also about paperwork, politeness, and manipulation. Solomon's capture didn't begin with a whip. It began with a conversation, a promise, a drink. And by the time he suspects danger, he's already halfway gone. This is the machinery of evil. Quiet, smiling legal. Brown and Hamilton were likely part of a larger network. Men who made profit by delivering free black citizens into slavery through forged documents and corrupt accomplices. In the 1840s and 50s, kidnappings like this were not rare. Newspapers documented them. Families feared them. But justice was elusive. Why? Because once a free man crossed into slave-holding territory, his word meant nothing. No papers, no freedom, just chains. And so the music is silenced. The family fades. The streets of Saratoga blur like dreams in a poisoned sleep. Solomon Northup, free man, husband, father, musician, will awaken to a new identity, not earned, but imposed. The transformation begins not with violence, but with forgetting. And when next he opens his eyes, even his name will be in question. Chapter 3. Some 3 hours elapsed, during which time I remained seated on a low bench, absorbed in painful meditations. At length I heard the crowing of a cock, and soon a distant rumbling sound, as of carriages hurrying through the streets, came to my ears, and I knew that it was day. No ray of light, however, penetrated my prison. Finally, I heard footsteps immediately overhead, as of someone walking to and fro. It occurred to me then that I must be in an underground apartment, and the damp, moldy odors of the place confirmed the supposition. The noise above continued for at least an hour, when at last I heard footsteps approaching from without. A key rattled in the lock, a strong door swung back upon its hinges, admitting a flood of light, and 2 men entered and stood before me. One of them was a large, powerful man, 40 years of age, perhaps, with dark, chestnut-colored hair, slightly interspersed with gray. His face was full, his complexion flush, his features grossly coarse, expressive of nothing but cruelty and cunning. He was about 5 feet 10 inches high, of full habit, and without prejudice, I must be allowed to say, was a man whose whole appearance was sinister and repugnant. His name was James Birch, as I learned afterwards, a well-known slave dealer in Washington, and then or lately connected in business as a partner with Theophilus Freeman of New Orleans. The person who accompanied him was a simple lackey named Ebenezer Radburn, who acted merely in the capacity of turnkey. Both of these men still live in Washington, or did, at the time of my return through that city from slavery in January last. The light admitted through the open door enabled me to observe the room in which I was confined. It was about 12 feet square, the walls of solid masonry. The floor was of heavy plank. There was one small window crossed with great iron bars, with an outside shutter securely fastened. An iron-bound door led into an adjoining cell or vault, wholly destitute of windows or any means of admitting light. The furniture of the room in which I was consisted of the wooden bench on which I sat, an old-fashioned dirty box stove, and besides these, in either cell there was neither bed nor blanket, nor any other thing whatever. The door through which Birch and Radburn entered led through a small passage, up a flight of steps into a yard, surrounded by brick wall 10 or 12 feet high, immediately in rear of a building of the same width as itself. The yard extended rearward from the house about 30 feet. In one part of the wall there was a strongly ironed door, opening into a narrow covered passage, leading along one side of the house into the street. The doom of the colored man, upon whom the door leading out of that narrow passage closed, was sealed. The top of the wall supported one end of a roof, which ascended inwards, forming a kind of open shed. Underneath the roof there was a crazy loft all round, where slaves, if so disposed, might sleep at night, or in inclement weather seek shelter from the storm. It was like a farmer's barnyard in most respects, save it was so constructed that the outside world could never see the human cattle that were herded there. The building to which the yard was attached was 2 stories high, fronting on one of the public streets of Washington. Its outside presented only the appearance of a quiet private residence. A stranger looking at it would never have dreamed of its execrable uses. Strange as it may seem, within plain sight of this same house, looking down from its commanding height upon it, was the Capitol. The voices of patriotic representatives boasting of freedom and equality, and the rattling of the poor slaves' chains, almost commingled. A slave pen within the very shadow of the Capitol. Such is a correct description, as it was in 1841, of William's slave pen in Washington, in one of the cellars of which I found myself so unaccountably confined. "Well, my boy, how do you feel now?" said Birch, as he entered through the open door. I replied that I was sick and inquired the cause of my imprisonment. He answered that I was his slave, that he had bought me, and that he was about to send me to New Orleans. I asserted aloud and boldly that I was a free man, a resident of Saratoga, where I had a wife and children who were also free, and that my name was Northup. I complained bitterly of the strange treatment I had received and threatened upon my liberation to have satisfaction for the wrong. He denied that I was free, and with an emphatic oath declared that I came from Georgia. Again and again I asserted I was no man's slave, and insisted upon his taking off my chains at once. He endeavored to hush me, as if he feared my voice would be overheard, but I would not be silent, and denounced the authors of my imprisonment, whoever they might be, as unmitigated villains. Finding he could not quiet me, he flew into a towering passion. With blasphemous oaths, he called me a black liar, a runaway from Georgia, and every other profane and vulgar epithet that the most indecent fancy could conceive. During this time, Radburn was standing silently by. His business was to oversee this human, or rather inhuman stable, receiving slaves, feeding and whipping them at the rate of 2 shillings a head per day. Turning to him, Birch ordered the paddle and cat-o' nine-tails to be brought in. He disappeared, and in a few moments returned with these instruments of torture. The paddle, as it is termed in slave-beating parlance, or at least the one with which I first became acquainted, and of which I now speak, was a piece of hardwood board, 18 or 20 inches long, molded to the shape of an old-fashioned pudding stick, or ordinary oar. The flattened portion, which was about the size and circumference of 2 open hands, was bored with a small auger in numerous places. The cat was a large rope of many strands unraveled, and a knot tied at the extremity of each. As soon as these formidable whips appeared, I was seized by both of them and roughly divested of my clothing. My feet, as has been stated, were fastened to the floor. Drawing me over the bench, face downwards, Radburn placed his heavy foot upon the fetters between my wrists, holding them painfully to the floor. With the paddle, Birch commenced beating me. Blow after blow was inflicted upon my naked body. When his unrelenting arm grew tired, he stopped and asked if I still insisted I was a free man. I did insist upon it, and then the blows were renewed faster and more energetically, if possible, than before. When again tired, he would repeat the same question, and receiving the same answer, continue his cruel labor. All this time, the incarnate devil was uttering most fiendish oaths. At length, the paddle broke, leaving the useless handle in his hand. Still I would not yield. All his brutal blows could not force from my lips the foul lie that I was a slave. Casting madly on the floor the handle of the broken paddle, he seized the rope. This was far more painful than the other. I struggled with all my power, but it was in vain. I prayed for mercy, but my prayer was only answered with imprecations and with stripes. I thought I must die beneath the lashes of the accursed brute. Even now the flesh crawls upon my bones as I recall the scene. I was all on fire. My sufferings I can compare to nothing else than the burning agonies of hell. At last I became silent to his repeated questions. I would make no reply. In fact, I was becoming almost unable to speak. Still he plied the lash without stint upon my poor body, until it seemed that the lacerated flesh was stripped from my bones at every stroke. A man with a particle of mercy in his soul would not have beaten even a dog so cruelly. At length Radburn said that it was useless to whip me any more, that I would be sore enough. Thereupon Birch desisted, saying, with an admonitory shake of his fist in my face, and hissing the words through his firm-set teeth, that if ever I dared to utter again that I was entitled to my freedom, that I had been kidnapped, or anything whatever the kind, The castigation I had just received was nothing in comparison with what would follow. He swore that he would either conquer or kill me. With these consolatory words, the fetters were taken from my wrists, my feet still remaining fastened to the ring. The shutter of the little barred window, which had been opened, was again closed, and going out, locking the great door behind them, I was left in darkness as before. In an hour, perhaps two, my heart leaped to my throat as the key rattled in the door again. I, who had been so lonely and who had longed so ardently to see someone, I cared not who, now shuddered at the thought of man's approach. A human face was fearful to me, especially a white one. Radburn entered, bringing with him on a tin plate a piece of shriveled fried pork, a slice of bread, and a cup of water. He asked me how I felt, and remarked that I had received a pretty severe flogging. He remonstrated with me against the propriety of asserting my freedom. In rather a patronizing and confidential manner, he gave it to me as his advice that the less I said on that subject, the better it would be for me. The men evidently endeavored to appear kind, whether touched at the sight of my sad condition, or with the view of silencing on my part any further expression of my rights. It is not necessary now to conjecture. He unlocked the fetters from my ankles, opened the shutters of the little window, and departed, leaving me again alone. By this time I had become stiff and sore. My body was covered with blisters, and it was with great pain and difficulty that I could move. From the window I could observe nothing but the roof resting on the adjacent wall. At night I laid down upon the damp, hard floor without any pillow or covering whatever. Punctually twice a day, Radburn came in with his pork and bread and water. I had but little appetite, though I was tormented with continual thirst. My wounds would not permit me to remain but a few minutes in any one position. So, sitting or standing or moving slowly round, I passed the days and nights. I was heart-sick and discouraged. Thoughts of my family, of my wife and children, continually occupied my mind. When sleep overpowered me, I dreamed I was again in Saratoga, that I could see their faces and hear their voices calling me. Awakening from the pleasant phantasms of sleep to the bitter realities around me, I could but groan and weep. Still my spirit was not broken. I indulged the anticipation of escape, and that speedily. It was impossible, I reasoned, that men could be so unjust as to detain me as a slave. When the truth of my case was known, Birch, ascertaining I was no runaway from Georgia, would certainly let me go. Though suspicions of Brown and Hamilton were not unfrequent, I could not reconcile myself to the idea that they were instrumental to my imprisonment. Surely they would seek me out, they would deliver me from thraldom. Alas, I had not then learned the measure of man's inhumanity to man, nor to what limitless extent of wickedness he will go for the love of gain. In the course of several days, the outer door was thrown open, allowing me the liberty of the yard. There I found 3 slaves, one of them a lad of 10 years, the others young men of about 20 and 25. I was not long in forming an acquaintance and learning their names and the particulars of their history. The eldest was a colored man named Clemens Ray. He had lived in Washington, had driven a hack, and worked in a livery stable there for a long time. He was very intelligent and fully comprehended his situation. The thought of going south overwhelmed him with grief. Birch had purchased him a few days before and had placed him there until such time as he was ready to send him to the New Orleans market. From him I learned for the first time that I was in William's slave pen, a place I had never heard of previously. He described to me the uses for which it was designed. I repeated to him the particulars of my unhappy story, but he could only give me the consolation of his sympathy. He also advised me to be silent henceforth on the subject of my freedom, for knowing the character of Birch, he assured me that it would only be attended with renewed whipping. The next eldest was named John Williams. He was raised in Virginia, not far from Washington. Birch had taken him in payment of a debt, and he constantly entertained the hope that his master would redeem him, a hope that was subsequently realized. The lad was a sprightly child that answered to the name of Randall. Most of the time he was playing about the yard, but occasionally would cry, calling for his mother and wondering when she would come. His mother's absence seemed to be the great and only grief in his little heart. He was too young to realize his condition, and when the memory of his mother was not in his mind, he amused us with his pleasant pranks. At night, Ray Williams and the boy slept in the loft of the shed, while I was locked in the cell. Finally, we were each provided with blankets, such as are used upon horses, the only bedding I was allowed to have for 12 years afterwards. Ray and Williams asked me many questions about New York, how colored people were treated there, how they could have homes and families of their own, with none to disturb and oppress them, and Ray especially sighed continually for freedom. Such conversations, however, were not in the hearing of Birch or the keeper Radburn. Aspirations such as these would have brought down the lash upon our backs. It is necessary in this narrative, in order to present a full and truthful statement of all the principal events in the history of my life, and to portray the institution of slavery as I have seen and known it, to speak of well-known places, and of many persons who are yet living. I am and always was an entire stranger in Washington and its vicinity aside from Birch and Radburn, knowing no man there, except as I have heard of them through my enslaved companions. What I am about to say, if false, can be easily contradicted. I remained in William's slave pen about 2 weeks. The night previous to my departure, a woman was brought in, weeping bitterly and leading by the hand a little child. They were Randall's mother and half-sister. On meeting them, he was overjoyed, clinging to her dress, kissing the child, and exhibiting every demonstration of delight. The mother also clasped him in her arms, embraced him tenderly, and gazed at him fondly through her tears, calling him by many an endearing name. Emily, the child, was 7 or 8 years old, of light complexion, and with a face of admirable beauty. Her hair fell in curls around her neck, while the style and richness of her dress and the neatness of her whole appearance indicated she had been brought up in the midst of wealth. She was a sweet child indeed. The woman also was arrayed in silk, with rings upon her fingers and golden ornaments suspended from her ears. Her air and manners, the correctness and propriety of her language, all showed evidently that she had sometimes stood above the common level of a slave. She seemed to be amazed at finding herself in such a place as that. It was plainly a sudden and unexpected turn of fortune that had brought her there. Filling the air with her complainings, she was hustled, with the children and myself, into the cell. Language can convey but an inadequate impression of the lamentations to which she gave incessant utterance, throwing herself upon the floor and encircling the children in her arms. She poured forth such touching words as only maternal love and kindness can suggest. They nestled closely to her, as if there only was there any safety or protection. At last they slept, their heads resting upon her lap. While they slumbered, she smoothed the hair back from their little foreheads and talked to them all night long. She called them her darlings, her sweet babes, poor innocent things that knew not the misery they were destined to endure. Soon they would have no mother to comfort them. They would be taken from her. What would become of them? Oh, she could not live away from her little Emmy and her dear boy. They had always been good children and had such loving ways. It would break her heart, God knew, she said, if they were taken from her. And yet she knew they meant to sell them, and maybe they would be separated and could never see each other any more. It was enough to melt a heart of stone to listen to the pitiful expressions of that desolate and distracted mother. Her name was Eliza, and this was the story of her life, as she afterwards related it. She was the slave of Elisha Berry, a rich man, living in the neighborhood of Washington. She was born, I think she said, on his plantation. Years before, he had fallen into dissipated habits and quarreled with his wife. In fact, soon after the birth of Randall, they separated, leaving his wife and daughter in the house they had always occupied. He erected a new one nearby, on the estate. Into this house he brought Eliza, and on condition of her living with him, she and her children were to be emancipated. She resided with him their 9 years, with servants to attend upon her, and provided with every comfort and luxury of life. Emily was his child, finally her young mistress, who had always remained with her mother at the homestead, married a Mr. Jacob Brooks. At length, for some cause, as I gathered from a relation, beyond Barry's control, a division of his property was made. She and her children fell to the share of Mr. Brooks. During the 9 years she had lived with Barry, in consequence of the position she was compelled to occupy, she and Emily had become the object of Mrs. Barry and her daughter's hatred and dislike. Barry himself she represented as a man of naturally a kind heart, who always promised her that she should have her freedom, and who she had no doubt would grant it to her then, if it were only in his power. As soon as they thus came into the possession and control of the daughter, it became very manifest they would not live long together. The sight of Eliza seemed to be odious to Mrs. Brooks. Neither could she bear to look upon the child half-sister, and beautiful as she was. The day she was led into the pen, Brooks had brought her from the estate into the city, under pretense that the time had come when her free papers were to be executed, in fulfillment of her master's promise. Elated at the prospect of immediate liberty, she decked herself and little Emmy in their best apparel, and accompanied him with a joyful heart. On their arrival in the city, instead of being baptized into the family of Freeman, she was delivered to the Trader Birch. The paper that was executed was a bill of sale. The hope of years was blasted in a moment. From a height of most exulting happiness to the utmost depths of wretchedness, she had that day descended. No wonder that she wept, and filled the pen with wailings and expressions of heart-rending woe. Eliza is now dead, far up the Red River, where it pours its waters sluggishly through the unhealthy lowlands of Louisiana. She rests in the grave at last, the only resting place of the poor slave. How all her fears were realized, how she mourned day and night, and never would be comforted how, as she predicted, her heart did indeed break, with the burden of maternal sorrow, will be seen as the narrative proceeds. He awakens in darkness, but this is no sleep. This is disappearance. Solomon Northup, once a man of name, freedom, and family, now finds himself shackled to a stone floor, with no memory of how he got there, and no one left who will believe him. This is the chapter where the light dies. The room is bare, the chains are real, and the silence is the most terrifying thing of all. He calls for help, but no help comes. He calls for justice, but the jailer's eyes are blank, and when he shouts his name, "I am Solomon Northup, a free man," they respond with cold laughter and call him by another name, Platt. This is not just a kidnapping. It is a reprogramming. Solomon isn't just locked away. He's being rewritten. No documents, no allies, no voice that matters. He tells them he's from New York, but they've heard it before. In the world of slavery, truth is meaningless without proof, and the black man's word, even a free man's, holds no weight when chains say otherwise. This chapter does not explode in violence. It suffocates in invisibility. Solomon is not tortured by pain. He is tortured by erasure. He knows who he is, but now, surrounded by brick walls and dead-eyed captors, even that knowledge begins to fray. He is gaslit by an entire system, one that tells him, you were never free. You belong to someone now, and no one is coming. This is psychological warfare, the kind that eats through memory like rust through iron. What Solomon experiences was not rare. It was systemic. Jails in Washington, D.C. regularly held kidnapped free black citizens, while papers were forged and names erased. Slave traders paid off officials, purchased silence, and rewrote men's lives with ink and threat. The problem wasn't lack of law. It was that the law served the chains. In Chapter 3, Solomon Northup does not yet lose his freedom. He loses something worse: believability. He screams his name. He pleads his truth, but no one listens. And so he learns the first brutal lesson of bondage. You are only as free as the world agrees you are. And in that room, on that stone floor, the world has gone deaf. Chapter 4. At intervals, during the first night of Eliza's incarceration in the pen, she complained bitterly of Jacob Brooks, her young mistress' husband. She declared that had she been aware of the deception he intended to practice upon her, he never would have brought her there alive. They had chosen the opportunity of getting her away when Master Barry was absent from the plantation. He had always been kind to her. She wished that she could see him, but she knew that even he was unable now to rescue her. Then would she commence weeping again, kissing the sleeping children, talking first to one, then to the other, as they lay in their unconscious slumbers with their heads upon her lap. So wore the long night away, and when the morning dawned and night had come again, still she kept mourning on, and would not be consoled. About midnight following, the cell door opened, and Birch and Radburn entered, with lanterns in their hands. Birch, with an oath, ordered us to roll up our blankets without delay, and get ready to go on board the boat. He swore we would be left unless we hurried fast. He aroused the children from their slumbers with a rough shake, and said they were sleepy. It appeared. Going out into the yard, he called Clem Ray, ordering him to leave the loft and come into the cell and bring his blanket with him. When Clem appeared, he placed us side by side and fastened us together with handcuffs, my left hand to his right. John Williams had been taken out a day or two before, his master having redeemed him, greatly to his delight. Clem and I were ordered to march, Eliza and the children following. We were conducted into the yard, from thence into the covered passage, and up a flight of steps through a side door into the upper room, where I had heard the walking to and fro. Its furniture was a stove, a few old chairs, and a long table, covered with papers. It was a whitewashed room, without any carpet on the floor, and seemed a sort of office. By one of the windows, I remember, hung a rusty sword, which attracted my attention. Birch's trunk was there. In obedience to his orders, I took hold of one of its handles with my unfettered hand, while taking hold of the other. We proceeded out of the front door into the street in the same order as we had left the cell. It was a dark night. All was quiet. I could see lights, or the reflection of them, over towards Pennsylvania Avenue, but there was no one, not even a straggler, to be seen. I was almost resolved to attempt to break away. Had I not been handcuffed, the attempt would certainly have been made, whatever consequence might have followed. Radburn was in the rear, carrying a large stick, and hurrying up the children as fast as the little ones could walk. So we passed handcuffed and in silence through the streets of Washington, through the capital of a nation, whose theory of government, we are told, rests on the foundation of man's inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Hail, Columbia, happy land indeed. Reaching the steamboat, we were quickly hustled into the hold, among barrels and boxes of freight. A colored servant brought a light. The bell rung, and soon the vessel started down the Potomac, carrying us we knew not where. The bell tolled as we passed the tomb of Washington. Birch, no doubt, with uncovered head, bowed reverently before the sacred ashes of the man who devoted his illustrious life to the liberty of his country. None of us slept that night but Randall and little Emmy. For the first time, Clem Ray was wholly overcome. To him, the idea of going south was terrible in the extreme. He was leaving the friends and associations of his youth, everything that was dear and precious to his heart, in all probability never to return. He and Eliza mingled their tears together, bemoaning their cruel fate. For my own part, difficult as it was, I endeavored to keep up my spirits. I resolved in my mind 100 plans of escape, and fully determined to make the attempt the first desperate chance that offered. I had by this time become satisfied, however, that my true policy was to say nothing further on the subject of my having been born a freeman. It would but expose me to maltreatment and diminish the chances of liberation. After sunrise in the morning, we were called up on deck to breakfast. Birch took our handcuffs off, and we sat down at table. He asked Eliza if she would take a dram. She declined, thanking him politely. During the meal, we were all silent, not a word passed between us. A mulatto woman who served the table seemed to take an interest in our behalf, told us to cheer up and not to be so cast down. Breakfast over, the handcuffs were restored, and Birch ordered us out on the stern deck. We sat down together on some boxes, still saying nothing in Birch's presence. Occasionally, a passenger would walk out to where we were, look at us for a while, then silently return. It was a very pleasant morning. The fields along the river were covered with verdure, far in advance of what I had been accustomed to see at that season of the year. The sun shone out warmly. The birds were singing in the trees. The happy birds, I envied them. I wished for wings like them, that I might cleave the air to where my birdlings waited vainly for their father's coming, in the cooler region of the north. In the forenoon, the steamer reached Aquia Creek. There the passengers took stages Birch and his 5 slaves, occupying one exclusively. He laughed with the children, and at one stopping place went so far as to purchase them a piece of gingerbread. He told me to hold up my head and look smart, that I might, perhaps, get a good master if I behaved myself. I made him no reply. His face was hateful to me, and I could not bear to look upon it. I sat in the corner, cherishing in my heart the hope, not yet extinct, of someday meeting the tyrant on the soil of my native state. At Fredericksburg, we were transferred from the stagecoach to a car, and before dark arrived in Richmond, the chief city of Virginia. At this city, we were taken from the cars and driven through the street to a slave pen between the railroad depot and the river, kept by a Mr. Gooden. This pen is similar to Williams in Washington, except it is somewhat larger. And besides, there were 2 small houses standing at opposite corners within the yard. These houses are usually found within slave yards, being used as rooms for the examination of human chattels by purchasers before concluding a bargain. Unsoundness in a slave, as well as in a horse, detracts materially from his value. If no warranty is given, a close examination is a matter of particular importance to the Negro jockey. We were met at the door of Gooden's yard by that gentleman, himself a short, fat man, with a round, plump face, black hair and whiskers, and a complexion almost as dark as some of his own Negroes. He had a hard, stern look, and was perhaps about 50 years of age. Birch and he met with great cordiality. They were evidently old friends, shaking each other warmly by the hand. Birch remarked he had brought some company, inquired at what time the brig would leave, and was answered that it would probably leave the next day at such an hour. Gooden then turned to me, took hold of my arm, turned me partly round, looked at me sharply with the air of one who considered himself a good judge of property, and as if estimating in his own mind about how much I was worth. "Well, boy, where'd you come from?" Forgetting myself for a moment, I answered, "From New York." "New York? H.O. What have you been doing up there?" was his astonished interrogatory. Observing Birch at this moment looking at me with an angry expression that conveyed a meaning it was not difficult to understand, I immediately said, "Oh, I have only been up that way a piece," in a manner intended to imply that although I might have been as far as New York, yet I wished it distinctly understood that I did not belong to that free state, nor to any other. Gooden then turned to Clem, and then to Eliza and the children, examining them severally and asking various questions. He was pleased with Emily, as was everyone who saw the child's sweet countenance. She was not as tidy as when I first beheld her. Her hair was now somewhat disheveled. but through its unkempt and soft profusion, there still beamed a little face of most surpassing loveliness. Altogether, we were a fair lot of devilish good lot, he said, enforcing that opinion with more than one emphatic adjective not found in the Christian vocabulary. Thereupon we passed into the yard. Quite a number of slaves, as many as 30 I should say, were moving about or sitting on benches under the shed. They were all cleanly dressed, the men with hats, the women with handkerchiefs tied about their heads. Birch and Gooden, after separating from us, walked up the steps at the back part of the main building and sat down upon the door sill. They entered into conversation, but the subject of it I could not hear. Presently Birch came down into the yard, unfettered me, and led me into one of the small houses. "You told that man you came from New York," said he. I replied, I told him I had been up as far as New York to be sure, but did not tell him I belonged there, nor that I was a freeman. I meant no harm at all, Master Birch. I would not have said it had I thought. He looked at me a moment, as if he was ready to devour me, then turning round went out. In a few minutes he returned. "If ever I hear you say a word about New York or about your freedom, I will be the death of you, I will kill you. You may rely on that," he ejaculated fiercely. I doubt not he understood then better than I did the danger and the penalty of selling a free man into slavery. He felt the necessity of closing my mouth against the crime he knew he was committing. Of course, my life would not have weighed a feather in any emergency requiring such a sacrifice. Undoubtedly, he meant precisely what he said. Under the shed on one side of the yard, there was constructed a rough table, while overhead were sleeping lofts the same as in the pen at Washington. After partaking at this table of our supper of pork and bread, I was handcuffed to a large yellow man, quite stout and fleshy, with a countenance expressive of the utmost melancholy. He was a man of intelligence and information, chained together. It was not long before we became acquainted with each other's history. His name was Robert. Like myself, he had been born free and had a wife and 2 children in Cincinnati. He said he had come south with 2 men who had hired him in the city of his residence. Without free papers, he had been seized at Fredericksburg, placed in confinement, and beaten until he had learned, as I had, the necessity and the policy of silence. He had been in Gooden's pen about 3 weeks. To this man, I became much attached. We could sympathize with and understand each other. It was with tears and a heavy heart, not many days subsequently, that I saw him die, and looked for the last time upon his lifeless form. Robert and myself, with Clem, Eliza, and her children, slept that night upon our blankets, in one of the small houses in the yard. There were 4 others, all from the same plantation, who had been sold and were now on their way south, who also occupied it with us. David and his wife, Caroline, both mulattoes, were exceedingly affected. They dreaded the thought of being put into the cane and cotton fields. But their greatest source of anxiety was the apprehension of being separated. Mary, a tall, lithe girl of a most jetty black, was listless and apparently indifferent. Like many of the class, she scarcely knew there was such a word as freedom. Brought up in the ignorance of a brute, she possessed but little more than a brute's intelligence. She was one of those, and there are very many, who fear nothing but their master's lash, and know no further duty than to obey his voice. The other was Lethe. She was of an entirely different character. She had long, straight hair and bore more the appearance of an Indian than a Negro woman. She had sharp and spiteful eyes and continually gave utterance to the language of hatred and revenge. Her husband had been sold. She knew not where she was. An exchange of masters, she was sure, could not be for the worse. She cared not whither they might carry her, pointing to the scars upon her face. The desperate creature wished that she might see the day when she could wipe them off in some man's blood. While we were thus learning the history of each other's wretchedness, Eliza was seated in a corner by herself, singing hymns and praying for her children. Wearied from the loss of so much sleep, I could no longer bear up against the advances of that sweet restorer, and laying down by the side of Robert on the floor, soon forgot my troubles, and slept until the dawn of day. In the morning, having swept the yard and washed ourselves under Goodin's superintendence, we were ordered to roll up our blankets and make ready for the continuance of our journey. Clem Ray was informed that he would go no further, Birch, for some cause, having concluded to carry him back to Washington. He was much rejoiced. Shaking hands, we parted in the slave pen at Richmond, and I have not seen him since. But much to my surprise, since my return, I learned that he had escaped from bondage and on his way to the free soil of Canada, lodged one night at the house of my brother-in-law in Saratoga, informing my family of the place and the condition in which he left me. In the afternoon, we were drawn up two abreast, Robert and myself in advance, and in this order, driven by Birch and Goodin from the yard, through the streets of Richmond to the brig Orleans. She was a vessel of respectable size, full-rigged, and freighted principally with tobacco. We were all on board by 5 o'clock. Birch brought us each a tin cup and a spoon. There were 40 of us in the brig, being all, except Clem, that were in the pen, with a small pocket knife that had not been taken from me. I began cutting the initials of my name upon the tin cup. The others immediately flocked round me, requesting me to mark theirs in a similar manner. In time, I gratified them all, of which they did not appear to be forgetful. We were all stowed away in the hold at night, and the hatch barred down. We laid on boxes, or wherever there was room enough to stretch our blankets on the floor. Birch accompanied us no farther than Richmond, returning from that point to the capital with Clem. Not until the lapse of almost 12 years, to wit, in January last in the Washington police office, did I set my eyes upon his face again. James H. Birch was a slave trader buying men, women, and children at low prices, and selling them in advance. He was a speculator in human flesh, a disreputable calling, and so considered at the South. For the present, he disappears from the scenes recorded in this narrative, but he will appear again before its close, not in the character of a man-whipping tyrant, but as an arrested, cringing criminal in a court of law that failed to do him justice. In Chapter 4, the mask comes off. The polite smiles are gone, and what remains is the raw engine of slavery, grinding through lives with mechanical cruelty. Solomon Northup, still crying out his name, now finds himself in the hands of James H. Birch, a dealer in flesh, whose job is not to ask questions, only to make men forget who they were. And if memory resists, the whip will teach. Solomon is chained. He protests. He demands his freedom, his papers, his justice. And Birch answers not with reason, but with the lash. The first beating is not just punishment. It is initiation. His back is torn open not because he lied, but because he dared tell the truth. And in that moment, a horrifying reality settles in. Truth has no power here. Solomon is no longer a man in their eyes. He is inventory, a product waiting to be sold. He is examined, stripped, tested like cattle. His violin is gone, his voice ignored, his name replaced. Birch tries to break him not only with the whip, but with words. You are my property. The brutality is not random. It is calculated, designed to wear down the soul, to smooth out the resistance. Like a river polishing stone, this scene takes place in one of many slave pens that existed in the nation's capital, just a few blocks from the U.S. Capitol itself. Yes, Washington, D.C., the heart of American democracy, was also a marketplace for stolen lives. Men like Birch operated with impunity, feeding human bodies into the Southern economy, while respectable society looked the other way. Solomon's cries for help would have echoed through the very streets that claimed to uphold liberty and justice for all. This chapter marks a turning point. Solomon, bloodied and stunned, learns what every enslaved person was forced to understand. Silence is safety. The truth won't save you. Your name won't save you. Your dignity is now a liability. The whip is more than punishment. It is indoctrination. In chapter 4, Solomon is not just imprisoned. He is redefined. From man to mule, from citizen to chattel, from Solomon to Platt. He does not yet accept this new identity. But the message is clear. If you resist, you bleed. And in a world where pain speaks louder than truth, resistance becomes a whisper, and survival becomes submission. Chapter 5. After we were all on board, the brig Orleans proceeded down James River, passing into Chesapeake Bay. We arrived next day opposite the city of Norfolk. While lying at anchor, a lighter approached us from the town, bringing 4 more slaves. Frederick, a boy of 18, had been born a slave, as also had Henry, who was some years older. They had both been house servants in the city. Maria was a rather genteel-looking colored girl, with a faultless form, but ignorant and extremely vain. The idea of going to New Orleans was pleasing to her. She entertained an extravagantly high opinion of her own attractions. Assuming a haughty mien, she declared to her companions that immediately on our arrival in New Orleans, she had no doubt some wealthy single gentleman of good taste would purchase her at once. But the most prominent of the 4 was a man named Arthur. As the lighter approached, he struggled stoutly with his keepers. It was with main force that he was dragged aboard the brig. He protested in a loud voice against the treatment he was receiving and demanded to be released. His face was swollen and covered with wounds and bruises, and indeed, one side of it was a complete raw sore. He was forced with all haste down the hatchway into the hold. I caught an outline of his story as he was borne struggling along, of which he afterwards gave me a more full relation, and it was as follows. He had long resided in the city of Norfolk and was a free man. He had a family living there and was a mason by trade. Having been unusually detained, he was returning late one night to his house in the suburbs of the city, when he was attacked by a gang of persons in an unfrequented street. He fought until his strength failed him. Overpowered at last, he was gagged and bound with ropes and beaten until he became insensible. For several days they secreted him in the slave pen at Norfolk, a very common establishment, it appears, in the cities of the South. The night before, he had been taken out and put on board the lighter, which, pushing out from shore, had awaited our arrival. For some time he continued his protestations and was altogether irreconcilable. At length, however, he became silent. He sank into a gloomy and thoughtful mood and appeared to be counseling with himself. There was in the man's determined face something that suggested the thought of desperation. After leaving Norfolk, the handcuffs were taken off, and during the day we were allowed to remain on deck. The captain selected Robert as his waiter, and I was appointed to superintend the cooking department and the distribution of food and water. I had 3 assistants, Jim, Cuffy, and Jenny. Jenny's business was to prepare the coffee, which consisted of cornmeal scorched in a kettle, boiled and sweetened with molasses. Jim and Cuffy baked the hoe cake and boiled the bacon. Standing by a table formed of a wide board resting on the heads of the barrels, I cut and handed to each a slice of meat and a dodger of the bread, and from Jenny's kettle also dipped out for each a cup of the coffee. The use of plates was dispensed with, and their sable fingers took the place of knives and forks. Jim and Cuffy were very demure and attentive to business, somewhat inflated with their situation as second cooks, and without doubt feeling that there was a great responsibility resting on them. I was called steward, a name given me by the captain. The slaves were fed twice a day, at 10 and 5 o'clock, always receiving the same kind and quantity of fare, and in the same manner as above described. At night we were driven into the hold and securely fastened down. Scarcely were we out of sight of land before we were overtaken by a violent storm. The brig rolled and plunged until we feared she would go down. Some were seasick, others on their knees praying, while some were fast holding to each other, paralyzed with fear. The seasickness rendered the place of our confinement loathsome and disgusting. It would have been a happy thing for most of us. It would have saved the agony of many hundred lashes, and miserable deaths at last had the compassionate sea snatched us that day from the clutches of remorseless men. The thought of Randall and little Emmy sinking down among the monsters of the deep is a more pleasant contemplation than to think of them as they are now, perhaps, dragging out lives of unrequited toil. When in sight of the Bahama Banks, at a place called Old Point Compass, or the Hole in the Wall, we were becalmed 3 days. There was scarcely a breath of air. The waters of the Gulf presented a singularly white appearance, like lime water. In the order of events, I come now to the relation of an occurrence, which I never call to mind, but with sensations of regret. I thank God, who has since permitted me to escape from the thraldom of slavery, that through his merciful interposition, I was prevented from imbruing my hands in the blood of his creatures. Let not those who have never been placed in like circumstances judge me harshly until they have been chained and beaten, until they find themselves in the situation I was, borne away from home and family toward the land of bondage. Let them refrain from saying what they would not do for liberty. How far I should have been justified in the sight of God and man, it is unnecessary now to speculate upon. It is enough to say that I am able to congratulate myself upon the harmless termination of an affair which threatened, for a time, to be attended with serious results. Towards evening, on the first day of the calm, Arthur and myself were in the bow of the vessel, seated on the windlass. We were conversing together of the probable destiny that awaited us, and mourning together over our misfortunes. Arthur said, and I agreed with him, that death was far less terrible than the living prospect that was before us. For a long time we talked of our children, our past lives, and of the probabilities of escape. Obtaining possession of the brig was suggested by one of us. We discussed the possibility of our being able, in such an event, to make our way to the harbor of New York. I knew little of the compass, but the idea of risking the experiment was eagerly entertained. The chances, for and against us, in an encounter with the crew was canvassed, who could be relied upon, and who could not. The proper time and manner of the attack were all talked over and over again. From the moment the plot suggested itself, I began to hope. I revolved it constantly in my mind. As difficulty after difficulty arose, some ready conceit was at hand, demonstrating how it could be overcome. While others slept, Arthur and I were maturing our plans. At length, with much caution, Robert was gradually made acquainted with our intentions. He approved of them at once, and entered into the conspiracy with a zealous spirit. There was not another slave we dared to trust. Brought up in fear and ignorance as they are, can scarcely be conceived how servilely they will cringe before a white man's look. It was not safe to deposit so bold a secret with any of them. And finally we three resolved to take upon ourselves alone the fearful responsibility of the attempt. At night, as has been said, we were driven into the hold and the hatch barred down. How to reach the deck was the first difficulty that presented itself. On the bow of the brig, however, I had observed the small boat lying bottom upwards. It occurred to me that by secreting ourselves underneath it, we would not be missed from the crowd, as they were hurried down into the hold at night. I was selected to make the experiment in order to satisfy ourselves of its feasibility. The next evening, accordingly, after supper, watching my opportunity, I hastily concealed myself beneath it. Lying close upon the deck, I could see what was going on around me, while wholly unperceived myself. In the morning, as they came up, I slipped from my hiding place without being observed. The result was entirely satisfactory. The captain and mate slept in the cabin of the former. From Robert, who had frequent occasion, in his capacity of waiter, to make observations in that quarter, we ascertained the exact position of their respective berths. He further informed us that there were always 2 pistols and a cutlass lying on the table. The crew's cook slept in the cook galley on deck, a sort of vehicle on wheels that could be moved about as convenience required, while the sailors, numbering only 6, either slept in the forecastle or in hammocks swung among the rigging. Finally, our arrangements were all completed. Arthur and I were to steal silently to the captain's cabin, seize the pistols and cutlass, and as quickly as possible dispatch him and the mate. Robert, with a club, was to stand by the door leading from the deck down into the cabin, and in case of necessity, beat back the sailors until we could hurry to his assistance. We were to proceed, then, as circumstances might require. Should the attack be so sudden and successful as to prevent resistance, the hatch was to remain barred down. Otherwise, the slaves were to be called up, and in the crowd and hurry and confusion of the time, we resolved to regain our liberty or lose our lives. I was then to assume the unaccustomed place of pilot, and steering northward, we trusted that some lucky wind might bear us to the soil of freedom. The mate's name was Biddy. The captain's I cannot now recall, though I rarely ever forget a name once heard. The captain was a small, genteel man, erect and prompt, with a proud bearing, and looked the personification of courage. If he is still living, and these pages should chance to meet his eye, he will learn a fact connected with the voyage of the brig from Richmond to New Orleans in 1841, not entered on his logbook. We were all prepared and impatiently waiting an opportunity of putting our designs into execution, when they were frustrated by a sad and unforeseen event. Robert was taken ill. It was soon announced that he had the smallpox. He continued to grow worse, and 4 days previous to our arrival in New Orleans, he died. One of the sailors sewed him in his blanket with a large stone from the ballast at his feet, and then laying him on a hatchway and elevating it with tackles above the railing. The inanimate body of poor Robert was consigned to the white waters of the Gulf. We were all panic-stricken by the appearance of the smallpox. The captain ordered lime to be scattered through the hold, and other prudent precautions to be taken. The death of Robert, however, and the presence of the malady oppressed me sadly, and I gazed out over the great waste of waters with a spirit that was indeed disconsolate. An evening or two after Robert's burial, I was leaning on the hatchway near the forecastle, full of desponding thoughts, when a sailor in a kind voice asked me why I was so downhearted. The tone and manner of the man assured me, and I answered because I was a freeman and had been kidnapped. He remarked that it was enough to make anyone downhearted, and continued to interrogate me until he learned the particulars of my whole history. He was evidently much interested in my behalf, and in the blunt speech of a sailor, swore he would aid me all he could, if it split his timbers. I requested him to furnish me pen, ink, and paper, in order that I might write to some of my friends. He promised to obtain them, but how I could use them undiscovered was a difficulty. If I could only get into the forecastle while his watch was off, and the other sailors asleep, the thing could be accomplished. The small boat instantly occurred to me. He thought we were not far from Belize at the mouth of the Mississippi, and it was necessary that the letter be written soon, or the opportunity would be lost. Accordingly, by arrangement, I managed the next night to secret myself again under the longboat. His watch was off at 12. I saw him pass into the forecastle, and in about an hour followed him. He was nodding over a table, half asleep, on which a sickly light was flickering, and on which also was a pen and sheet of paper. As I entered, he aroused, beckoned me to a seat beside him, and pointed to the paper. I directed the letter to Henry B. Northup, of Sandy Hill, stating that I had been kidnapped, was then on board the brig Orleans bound for New Orleans, that it was then impossible for me to conjecture my ultimate destination, and requesting he would take measures to rescue me. The letter was sealed and directed, and Manning, having read it, promised to deposit it in the New Orleans post office. I hastened back to my place under the longboat, and in the morning, as the slaves came up and were walking round, crept out unnoticed and mingled with them. My good friend, whose name was John Manning, was an Englishman by birth and a noble-hearted, generous sailor as ever walked a deck. He had lived in Boston, was a tall, well-built man, about 24 years old, with a face somewhat pockmarked, but full of benevolent expression. Nothing to vary the monotony of our daily life occurred until we reached New Orleans. On coming to the levee, and before the vessel was made fast, I saw Manning leap on shore and hurry away into the city. As he started off, he looked back over his shoulder significantly, giving me to understand the object of his errand. Presently he returned, and passing close by me, hunched me with his elbow, with a peculiar wink, as much as to say, "It is all right." The letter, as I have since learned, reached Sandy Hill. Mr. Northup visited Albany and laid it before Governor Seward. But inasmuch as it gave no definite information as to my probable locality, it was not, at that time, deemed advisable to institute measures for my liberation. It was concluded to delay, trusting that a knowledge of where I was might eventually be obtained. A happy and touching scene was witnessed immediately upon our reaching the levee. Just as Manning left the brig, on his way to the post office, two men came up and called aloud for Arthur. The latter, as he recognized them, was almost crazy with delight. He could hardly be restrained from leaping over the brig's side. And when they met soon after, he grasped them by the hand and clung to them a long, long time. They were men from Norfolk, who had come on to New Orleans to rescue him. His kidnappers, they informed him, had been arrested and were then confined in the Norfolk prison. They conversed a few moments with the captain, and then departed with the rejoicing Arthur. But in all the crowd that thronged the wharf, there was no one who knew or cared for me. Not one. No familiar voice greeted my ears, nor was there a single face that I had ever seen. Soon Arthur would rejoin his family, and have the satisfaction of seeing his wrongs avenged. My family, alas, should I ever see them more? There was a feeling of utter desolation in my heart, filling it with a despairing and regretful sense that I had not gone down with Robert to the bottom of the sea. Very soon traders and consignees came on board. One, a tall, thin-faced man, with light complexion and a little bent, made his appearance, with a paper in his hand. Birch's gang, consisting of myself, Eliza, and her children, Harry, Lethe, and some others, who had joined us at Richmond, were consigned to him. This gentleman was Mr. Theophilus Freeman. Reading from his paper, he called Platt. No one answered. The name was called again and again, but still there was no reply. Then Lethe was called, then Eliza, then Harry, until the list was finished, each one stepping forward as his or her name was called. "Captain, where's Platt?" demanded Theophilus Freeman. The captain was unable to inform him, no one being on board answering to that name. "Who shipped that nigger?" he again inquired of the captain, pointing to me. "Birch," replied the captain. "Your name is Platt, you answer my description. Why don't you come forward?" he demanded of me, in an angry tone. I informed him that was not my name, that I had never been called by it, but that I had no objection to it, as I knew of. "Well, I will learn you your name," said he, "and so you won't forget it either, he added. Mr. Theophilus Freeman, by the way, was not a whit behind his partner, Birch, in the matter of blasphemy. On the vessel, I had gone by the name of Steward, and this was the first time I had ever been designated as Platt, the name forwarded by Birch to his consignee. From the vessel, I observed the chain gang at work on the levee. We passed near them as we were driven to Freeman's slave pen. This pen is very similar to Gooden's in Richmond, except the yard was enclosed by plank, standing upright, with ends sharpened, instead of brick walls. Including us, there were now at least 50 in this pen, depositing our blankets in one of the small buildings in the yard. And having been called up and fed, we were allowed to saunter about the enclosure until night, when we wrapped our blankets around us and lay down under the shed, or in the loft, or in the open yard, just as each one preferred. It was but a short time I closed my eyes that night. Thought was busy in my brain, Could it be possible that I was thousands of miles from home, that I had been driven through the streets like a dumb beast, that I had been chained and beaten without mercy, that I was even then herded with a drove of slaves? A slave myself? Were the events of the last few weeks realities indeed? Or was I passing only through the dismal phases of a long, protracted dream? It was no illusion. My cup of sorrow was full to overflowing. Then I lifted up my hands to God, and in the still watches of the night, surrounded by the sleeping forms of my companions, begged for mercy on the poor, forsaken captive. To the Almighty Father of us, all the freemen and the slave, I poured forth the supplications of a broken spirit, imploring strength from on high to bear up against the burden of my troubles, until the morning light aroused the slumberers, ushering in another day of bondage. Chapter 5 brings us to the marketplace of broken souls. Solomon Northup, now beaten into silence and renamed Platt, is marched to Richmond Street with others, not to be tried, not to be freed, but to be priced. This is the moment the system reveals itself in full. No masks, no excuses, just commerce and flesh. The scene is almost too unbearable in its normalcy. Children play in the yard while their parents are measured like horses. Men poke, prod, inspect. Jaws are open, shoulders pressed, hands clapped. These are not gestures of care. They are calculations. Weight, strength, fertility. A woman holds her child tightly. Terrified, they will be separated. And in a moment that shatters even the strongest resolve, they are, "My poor child, you shall see him no more." Her scream is not just grief. It is the sound of a soul breaking, and no one around her flinches. This chapter unveils slavery's most monstrous truth. It doesn't just chain the body, it shreds a family. To the traders, this is not cruelty. It is efficiency. Families are divided because selling a woman without a child is more profitable than selling them together. Love is not in the ledger, only value. And Solomon, forced to watch, unable to act, knows that he could be next. One wrong word, one moment of recognition, and he too could be torn from himself once more. Slave markets were commonplace in the 1800s, not hidden but public. Men like Theophilus Freeman, introduced in this chapter, were professional traders. They kept ledgers, placed ads, and negotiated human lives the way others might buy corn or cotton. This wasn't back alley villainy. It was business as usual in a country built on freedom. For some, what's most haunting is Solomon's restraint. He watches mothers lose children. He watches a man sob with shame after being sold. And still, he says nothing. Not because he does not feel, but because he now understands. A word, a single word, and I might share their fate. His silence is not surrender. It is strategy. Because in this hell, to survive, you must vanish, even from yourself. And so Solomon waits, his name stolen, his freedom buried, his voice silent. He has not given up. He is not yet broken. But in chapter 5, he stands at the threshold of a new life. A life in chains, a life among strangers, a life no longer his own. And he will soon be sold into the South, where the true horrors begin.
A signature on paper, a name erased, a man stolen from himself. You've just heard part 1 of 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup, chapters 1 to 5. Told in his own words, this isn't just history, it's testimony. I'm Raul, and this is Audible Archives. If this chapter moved you, like, comment, and subscribe. We'll continue the story, because the truth demands to be heard. And so, the tale draws to a close, but the echoes remain here in the Audible Archives. And until our next journey through shadow and story, keep listening, keep wondering, because every ending hides another beginning. Audible Archives, where stories never sleep.